10 years ago, just ahead of the 140th year anniversary celebrations of Mahatma Gandhi's birth anniversary, the United Nations had declared today, October 2nd, as International Non-Violence Day. 10 years later, as we prepare for the beginning of the birth anniversary year of Bapu and the 150th year, India is pleased to have the UN Secretary-General, Mr. António Guterres. And if I could ask Mr. Amitabh Kant, the CEO of the National Institution for Transforming India, to welcome him.
Thank you, Suhasini. I think we'll just keep it informal with your permission, Excellency. I've just had this. Okay. We have this young audience which has been waiting for quite some time, very patiently. But I've had the pleasure of listening to a wonderful speech on sanitation in the morning by the Secretary General. He's a very remarkable person, very multifaceted personality in many ways. He's been a peace broker, a bridge builder, a promoter of reforms, a very key driver of innovation, and a very key driver of innovation in the and of structural reforms in the UN system. His Excellency has been the Prime Minister of Portugal from 1995 to 2002. He was the President of the European Council in 2000. He led the adoption of the Lisbon Agenda for Growth and Jobs. So all of you can ask him all the questions on jobs. He's been the member of the Portuguese Council from 1991 to 2002, a very, very long tenure. He's been then the UN High Commissioner for Refugees from June 2005 to December 2015, almost a decade. And he was there in the midst of some of the most major challenges, some of the most serious displacement crises in the world. Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Yemen, all of these were confronted by him. And he was a very aggressive player during that period. But more than all that, he's been an activist in the Socialist International. He's been, which is a worldwide organization of social democratic parties across the world. He's been a member of the Club Madrid, a leadership alliance of democratic former presidents and prime ministers from around the world. So you can see what a unique personality you have in front of you. A tremendous personality, Mr. António Guterres, and in the morning he's given a fabulous lecture on sanitation. He's a very key driver of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we in Niti Aayog are very fortunate to be his development partner. We work in very close cooperation and partnership to drive SDGs in India. But more on that later. Let me now turn to the Secretary General, because all of you are very patiently waiting to listen to him, and then we'll open it up.
Well, thank you so very much for your very kind words. And the first thing I must say is that I'm not always as impolite as today, because today I was not being able to control my schedule, and we had the conference this morning, then we had the official lunch, and then the bilateral meeting between the Prime Minister Modi and the UN, and so I really could not come earlier. So I apologize, and I promise that next time I will be on time. Well, when one looks at today's world, it is true that we face enormous challenges, global challenges, challenges that cannot be solved by any country by itself. Climate change is probably the defining question of our times. Terrorism, international criminality. We see a multiplication of conflicts everywhere in the world, and conflicts that are interlinked with each other. We see the impacts of new technologies that are difficult to control in all its dimensions. And so more and more, we would need a global response to these global challenges. We would need the possibility to have multilateral approaches to deal with them. But the paradox is that never in recent times was multilateralism so much under fire, and never as in recent times were rules-based international community areas being so terribly put under fire by different countries. Look at the trade wars that are taking place at the present moment. This is a paradox. I believe that behind this paradox is largely a huge deficit of trust. Trust between peoples and political establishments. And this, interestingly, is much bigger in the western part of the world, in the Americas and in Europe, than in South Asia or in East Asia. I feel that the trust of people in relation to their institutions is bigger here in India or in China than it is today in Europe or in the United States. But in most of the world, there is this enormous deficit of trust. People just do not trust their ruling elites. But trust among countries and trust, or deficit of trust among countries and deficit of trust about international organizations. People thinking that, oh, the UN doesn't solve the problem. We need to try to solve the problem by ourselves. Or why to go to World Trade Organization? Let's do it bilaterally. So this is the paradox we are facing. The more the challenges are global, the more the threats are global, the less we seem able to prepare global responses, global answers in order to defend humankind in these very difficult moments. And at the same time, it is clear that the world that was bipolar when we had the Cold War, that was unipolar during the period of American supremacy in the 90s when I was in government, is not yet, it's no longer bipolar or unipolar, but it's not yet also multipolar. It's a kind of a chaotic world where power relations became unclear and where impunity and unpredictability tend to prevail. And this is the reason why we see this multiplication of conflicts that nobody controls, and we see the number of dangers that are spreading around the world. Now, in my opinion, it is vital that we work towards the creation of a multipolar architecture for our world. And I believe that India has an absolutely key role to play for that to be possible. If one looks at what many people say about the future, they say, oh, in 20 years' time, the world will have two gigantic economies, the United States and China, and they will be the key controllers of the world. People say we will move from the G20 to the G2. Now, the drama is, if that would be true, very probably those two would be in confrontation, and we would move from the G2 to a G0. And so it is absolutely essential to create factors of equilibrium, to create a real multipolar world. And for that, no country is better placed than India, because of its dimension, because of its capacity, technological capacity, innovation capacity, knowledge capacity, and of course, its geostrategic location. India is an absolutely essential component of our future multipolar world. And India can then network with others and create the conditions for a world where equilibrium prevails and where the risks of confrontation that we have today do not exist, or the risks of confrontation of other models do not exist, and whether it will be possible to reestablish a system of multilateral governance with a rules-based international set of relations. This is the kind of world we want, able to respond globally to global challenges, and in my opinion, India's assertiveness is a key element to make it possible. We are not there. We live in this chaotic situation where rules are not respected and where our capacity to respond to the challenge is not there. But we don't necessarily move in the right direction. There are risks to move in wrong directions. There are others not interested in creating this equilibrium, this harmony. So India is here a country with an extremely important role, and it is absolutely essential that India plays that role and others respect it. And this was very much in the center of my discussions with Prime Minister Modi during this afternoon. Now, in this context, it is clear that we are facing, at today's situation, a terrible multiplication of conflicts and a link between those conflicts that are more and more interrelated and a link with global terrorism. If you look at the map and look at the news, you hear about Nigeria, Mali, you hear about Libya, you hear about Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Palestine, Afghanistan. And the truth is that all these conflicts are today effectively interlinked. Fighters move from one country to another, and all these countries are linked to a new reality, which is the reality of global terrorism. There was always terrorism, but this kind of terrorism that is global, that can strike anywhere at any time, is new. And the point is that with the power relations becoming unclear, with the lack of what I mentioned, equilibrium in international relations, impunity and unpredictability tend to prevail. And that is why it is so important an agenda of prevention, an agenda of mediation, to have, as you were saying, honest brokers, to have build bridge, those that are able to build bridges, and to have, as much as possible, the capacity to bring people to respect each other and people to be able to understand each other and to overcome their differences, not by conflict, but by compromise. And there are some winds of hope. You probably have heard that Ethiopia and Eritrea, that were in a state of war, even if not necessarily of permanent conflict, have reached peace just a few weeks ago. There are other indications that Eritrea and Djibouti are coming into that direction. The leader of South Sudan finally signed the peace agreement after the large number of years of war. So it's true that when the international community comes together, it's true that when diplomacy prevails, conflicts can be solved. But we need a much stronger effort than the one that exists today. And again, we need honest brokers. We need people, countries that all sides can respect. And I believe India can also be an honest broker. India has not a specific agenda in many of these areas of the world, so Indian diplomacy can play a very important role in trying to bring together different actors and trying to make some of these conflicts find a solution and other conflicts be avoided in many of the situations where we know that risks are there, and we need to do everything possible to make sure those risks don't translate themselves into new forms of war. On the other hand, we have today what I would say the biggest threat for the future of humankind, and that is climate change. Climate change is running faster than what we are. All the things we are witnessing in the world are going worse than the predictions of scientists. Many were saying, oh, scientists are exaggerating. Climate change, this is not true. The truth is that science indeed were wrong, but because things are getting worse than what was predicted. And this is having impacts everywhere, and India is, by the way, a country that is being already impacted by climate change in drought, in floods, in several other aspects. Look at the Himalayas, glaciers receding. We don't know exactly what will be the impacts that it will have south, but it's not only India, it's everywhere in the world. We see storms becoming more frequent, more dramatic, more intense, with more terrible humanitarian consequences. We see the rise of temperature in the water having that impact. We see corals bleaching. We see diversity being put into question. So climate change is running faster than what we are. In Paris, there was an agreement in which the international community came together to try to stop climate change with an increase of temperature acceptable for the end of the century, according to Paris, of between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Even if there is already a prediction published in a magazine, Nature, a few weeks ago, saying that even the 2 degrees would mean a rise in the waters of 4 meters in the oceans. Let's hope they are wrong, because that would be a devastating disaster around the world. But it is clear that if this is not reached, if this target of Paris is not reached, we will face a major catastrophic situation in the world. And the truth is that we are not getting there. Most of the commitments made for Paris are not being met by states. And at the same time, we saw in the United States the government coming out, even if the society, the businesses, the cities are responding. And we see in many other parts of the world this priority losing ground, things going slower. For instance, coal plants that were supposed to be closed are still operating. Many other aspects, subsidies to fossil fossil fuels are going on being given. We see still infrastructure being built that are not green and that will have dramatic impact in the decades to come. So climate change is really running faster than what we are. And again, here is an area where I believe India can play a very important role. India, even if it is a developing country, even if it has enormous challenges, India has understood that technology and economy are now in favor of climate action. The green technologies are becoming the best technologies. The Stone Age did not end for lack of stones. When the Stone Age ended, there were plenty of rocks in the world. It ended because other technologies replaced the use of stones. The fossil fuel age will not end for lack of fossil fuels. It will end when people will bet on green energy, on green transportation, on green agriculture. And what is fantastic is that more and more green economy becomes the good economy. If you look today, this evening there will be a meeting of the International Solar Alliance, but today solar and wind energies are cheaper than the energies produced by coal or by oil or by gas. So technology and the economy are on our side, but there is still a lot of reluctance in many political powers to move fast enough. And I believe India has a key role to play, leading, even with all its difficulties and problems, leading in making sure that people in the world understand that we need to run as fast as climate change, and we need to be able to take all the measures that are necessary in order to be able to contain the dramatic impacts of a runaway climate change that we want to avoid at all costs. On the other hand, you are students. I see several of you with interesting machines. No? When I had your age, those machines did not exist. Technology is moving very fast. Connectivity is moving very fast. And technology has provided enormous benefits to humankind. It's clear. I don't think that all of you here in this room would live easily without the internet, no? You would be in trouble. And at the same time, we see how medicine has improved thanks to technology. We see how transportation has improved thanks to technology. We see how productivity in agriculture is improved thanks to technology. The economy has dramatically improved thanks to technology. I mean, our capacity to do things that were thought impossible are now possible thanks to the evolution of science and technology. But at the same time, there are risks. Genetic engineering has allowed us to have enormous capacity to cure diseases, but we can produce monsters with genetic engineering. It's something that we can do even now. If you look at the cyberspace, I mean, we need the cyberspace to live. The cyberspace is where we operate, but it's also where some terrorist groups operate. It's where some sexual exploitation and abuse takes place. We look into artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence can produce fantastic impacts that will allow the Sustainable Development Goals to be more easily implemented than without those technologies. But artificial intelligence will generate impacts in the global economy in which many jobs that today exist will put into risk. All revolutions had a massive destruction of jobs and a massive creation of jobs. It was the first, the second, the third, but now it's the fourth industrial revolution. And what we know is that there will be a massive destruction of jobs, there will be a creation of new jobs, but it will not be easy to recycle people from the old jobs to the new ones. And so we will have serious problems. And obviously, I think the young generations, with more modern education and more adequate training, will be the ones that will be more easy to adapt to the kind of jobs that will be generated by the new technologies, by the fourth industrial revolution, and by artificial intelligence in relation to it, in relation to many others. The problem is that we are seeing huge opportunities and huge threats. But contrary to situations in the past, where there were clear regulations to make sure that we could take profit of the opportunities, but we could limit the negative impacts, today these sectors are not easy to regulate. I mean, usually there is an international convention on some kind of issue. No, I mean, And the international convention takes years to negotiate, and then takes years to be signed and ratified by countries. As you know, artificial intelligence in 3 or 4 months moves much more quickly, which means that we cannot regulate by traditional ways. Governments alone cannot do it. More and more we need to have platforms of dialogue between governments, scientists, civil society, companies, to be able to agree on a number of, no rigid laws, but a number of protocols, a number of norms, a number of codes of conduct that will allow to make sure that these new technologies will be for the good of humankind. On the other hand, if one looks at today's world, there is an enormous economic progress, but inequalities are on the rise. And inequalities are a terrible factor of instability and a terrible factor of suffering around the world. We need a fair globalization. Globalization has brought enormous benefits everywhere, but it has its losers. For instance, even a modern society like the United States, the Rust Belt, you have heard about the Rust Belt, the area that was more dramatically negatively impacted by the globalization, it is the area where people decided to vote in ways that were not expected. And you see the Brexit in England, and you see many other areas of uncertainty that come from the inequalities and the dangers generated by the same globalization. That is why we are so strongly betting for the Sustainable Development Goals. The idea that economic development needs to leave no one behind, needs to simultaneously to produce wealth, but to reduce inequality. And this is the objective of the strategy that we've put forward, and I was very happy to see that India is taking it very seriously. For instance, this morning we were discussing sanitation. Sanitation is not only the fact that, of course, things are cleaner and that people benefit from clean water and people have adequate toilets, etc. It's the positive impact in the well-being, in health. And everything is interrelated. And that is why that in the previous generation had the Millennium Development Goals, 8 objectives in relation to 8 aspects that were separated. Now, the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, correspond to a comprehensive approach to development in order to be able to respond to the basic needs of every society and to try to address the problems of inequality that are leaving so many people behind and are creating so many sources of instability in the world. And again, India has a key role to play. India that has a huge economic growth capacity, but at the same time still very, very high levels of poverty. India has a key role to play in leading to prove that the Sustainable Development Goals can be achieved, which means that in diplomacy, being an honest broker, in leading for climate change, in leading for technological evolution to be a force for good and not a force that puts into question our basic values, and in making sure that we have a fair globalization. In all these aspects, India can play a very important role, is playing already, and can play more and more in the years to come. And for the UN, it is absolutely essential that India assumes that responsibility and that leadership, because with its dimension, with its power, it is irreplaceable. Other countries can contribute, and it's very important to network among countries, namely in the developing world, but no other country has the dimension, the progress, the technology, the capacity that India has to be a factor of equilibrium and to be able to compensate for the power of others in order to make sure that we move into a truly multipolar world, but a multipolar world that is run in the context of multilateral institutions and the rules-based set of international relations.
Thank you so much. I hope you can see the questions I have. These are just from the overflow room. But our audience today, which is made up of students, of journalists, of people who are working in development, have a lot of the questions that you've already dealt with in your speech. Just to kick it off, you spoke about climate change, and I do want to ask Yang Shaurya there to start this town hall. And then after that, I'm going to ask you all to put up your hands and we'll try and take as many questions as possible.
The United Nations is responsible for the welfare of all the countries of the world. Of all the countries of the world.
Welfare.
then why is it that superpower
That is
countries...
asked too much.
Then why is it that superpower countries like the US not agree on reducing their carbon emissions, even when this means submerging of many small island countries into the sea? And all of this keeping in mind that countries like the US could become developed in the first place only by the excessive use of emissions, which is primarily the reason of this whole situation here. here. Yeah.
Well, you have referred to the reality. Power relations are unequal. No? There are still superpowers, and there are still countries with very limited capacity. And superpowers tend to abuse their power, and tend to use their power to their own benefit, forgetting that sometimes the risks that the others suffer will sooner or later become their own risks. If you look at the wildfires in California, you see that the United States is already paying a heavy price for climate change. And my hope is that the civil society, the businesses community, the cities that in the United States are showing an enormous dynamism will be able one day to make the US political power understand that climate change is a matter of survival for everybody, including for the United States themselves.
All right. You also mentioned the multilateral structure and India's role in it, as well as the question of that I know is on the lips of many here, which is the question of UN reform. We got a question over the internet that said, what is the Secretary General's plan to make United Nations Security Council more representative and reflective of geopolitical realities of the 21st century? And there's a young gentleman here as well, if we can just get him a mic, who had...
Well, I do not have a plan for a simple reason, that I do not have the power to do it. That is strictly depending on member states. The reform of the Security Council needs to be approved by 2/3 of the General Assembly, including in these 2/3 the whole 5 permanent present members of the Security Council. So this is a difficult problem to solve, but it is a problem. The Security Council we have today is a Security Council that corresponds more or less to the world after the Second World War. And the world of today is completely different from the world of the Second World War. And the result is very simple. If you look at what has happened in the recent past, the Security Council has been paralyzed in relation to many of the most dramatic crises that we have been facing. So we have a basic dysfunctionality in the system. But to address this dysfunctionality, we need 2/3 of the General Assembly and the agreement of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, that are those exactly that tend to veto some of the problems, some of the situations that you are all very clear about. I've been saying, and I will repeat it everywhere, no reform of the UN is completed without reform of the Security Council. I'm doing, or trying to do, a lot of reforms at the level of Secretariat, at the level of efficiency, cost efficiency, making the system more coherent, more coordinated, more accountable, more transparent, but that is at the level of the agencies, at the level of the Secretariat, at the level of the member states, and the bodies that represent the member states, Security Council and General Assembly. There I have no power. It's the member states that have the power, and unfortunately, they have not been open enough to be bold in reforming, namely the Security Council, that obviously is the body that is responsible for maintaining peace and security in the world, and its dysfunctionality is well reflected in many of the crises that we see.
You had a specific question, right?
Yes. So what do you think, how many more years it will take from now to include India in UN Security Council?
To
include India in UN Security Council.
That's direct.
If I knew, and if I would be able to guess these kind of things, I would be rich, because I would be buying lottery every day and winning. It's difficult to know. I hope that at a certain moment people will understand that it's in the benefit of everybody to change. And there are some things that, of course, are clear. India, for instance, is a member, is a country that has been expressing its strong will to become a permanent member of the Security Council. And let's look at the dimension of India. This is a perfectly reasonable position. But again, we are still far from a situation in which that reform will take place. Let's all work for that to be possible. But if I would say that next year we will solve the problem, I would be cheating.
All right, that's fairly candid. I think the lady over there has.
So you mentioned climatic change as a threat.
Sorry, where I don't see.
She's
you.
in. Stand up. Why did you stand?
Oh yes. No, you can see that. I just didn't see. We're not seeing you.
So you had mentioned climatic change as a threat we are facing in the current context, and countries are recognizing the growing need to address such climatic change.
So I'm deaf, and there is a reverberation.
Just
in the
ask
sound.
the question.
So you need
Okay,
to
so
instead of
slowly.
any.
Okay.
Speak slowly.
What is your stance on climate refugees, given the fact that environmental triggers are not recognized under the 1951 Convention on Refugees? So a country is not required to take in refugees and grant them a status of refugees on the basis of environmental considerations. So what is your stance on this, and how do you see, how can this issue be addressed by nation states?
Indeed, the 51 Convention does not include in the reasons for someone to be considered a refugee and benefit from the international regime of refugee protection. It includes conflict, it includes persecution of different kinds. Can be persecution, political persecution, but it can be persecution for reasons of gender or for reasons of sexual preference or for whatever reason. So climate change is not included. And I don't think there is a chance to change the convention to include it, because if we try to change the convention, in my opinion, we'll come out with the worst convention. Because today's human rights commitment in the world is not fantastic. I mean, we have seen the human rights agenda losing ground to many other agendas, so I wouldn't touch the convention. A number of countries, with my support, I was High Commissioner for Refugees, launched a process whose aim was to discuss what forms of protection should the international community try to engage, independently of the 51 Convention, in relation to those that flee their countries for reasons linked to climate change, that no longer can live in their countries because there are no living conditions possible there. They approved a set of principles, but of course they are not universal. My attempt at the time was to try to convince those countries to move into a direction similar to what was approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the guiding principles on internal displacement. You might have heard about it, which is not those that cross the border, but those that stay within the borders of their own country. We couldn't get there. And even in the compact on migration, that is, as you know, being now prepared for approval in Marrakesh, the problem is not solved. There were interesting developments at regional level, both in Latin America and in Africa. I think there is a positive attitude, and the new regional instruments that were approved are more progressive in relation to these. But it's slow progress. It's slow progress. And indeed, the problem is becoming more and more dramatic, as most of the people flee and remain within the borders of their own countries, but in some situations, and of course the extreme situation will be some islands in the Pacific that risk to completely disappear because of the raising level of the water of the oceans. So this is a problem for which we have not yet a legal solution. And that is not only a question of being a refugee, it's also the question of their national identity, their cultural identity. I mean, can we conceive an idea of a state without a territory? It's a very, no, maybe, I mean, I don't know, but it's something that probably we'll have to think about. I mean, the traditional legal instruments might not be adequate to some of the situations that will be created in the future.
Right. In fact, one of the problems is also that you will have refugees who are fleeing violence who will become climate refugees because the areas that they are being settled in are not always open. You know, earlier this year, we saw some very emotional moments when you visited Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh and visited and spoke with so many of the Rohingya refugees. And I bring that up because we've got so many questions from readers, viewers everywhere asking about what can be done for them. I think there was a young lady here who had a question as well. If we could just get the mic to the lady in white. Yeah.
So in your speech, since you addressed the kind of trust deficit that exists between governments and people and governments globally, so my question was that how exactly can we tackle issues of climate change, which we need to have viable solutions accepted by governments globally, and also considering how governments don't trust each other? How exactly then can we come to a situation where governments of, developed countries also consider needs of underdeveloped countries and then come to a viable solution?
But that's about climate change.
That is
Yes,
on
that's
climate
itself.
change.
Now, we have now negotiations taking place. There was a meeting in Bangkok that did not end sufficiently well, and there will be the COP. COP is the conference of parties that is supposed to approve so-called rules book related to the Paris Agreement, which means the set of norms to allow the implementation of the Paris Agreement. The negotiations are not going completely well. We are very worried. And so now I'm making a huge campaign talking to countries and to governments everywhere to make sure that they come to an agreement to allow for that rules book to be approved, to allow for the implementation of the Paris Agreement not to be put into question. But then there are two other moments that will be very important for me. I don't know if I mentioned it already today. I'm convening a summit for 2019 in which I'm making several speeches saying, look, this is not going well. Climate change is running faster than what we are, and things are not going well, to make sure that people understand that we are at risk, and serious risk. But we will have a summit, heads of state and government, that I'm convening for 2019 to really ask them to assume for 2020, when each country will be presenting their new commitments in relation to the so-called, in relation to the measures that we will take in relation to climate change, to be much more ambitious than what was happened in Paris, because Paris is not enough. The commitments made in Paris, according to estimates, will lead to an increase of more than 3 degrees Celsius at the end of the century, and that's catastrophic. So we need stronger commitments, and we are making everything we can to make countries understand that. I will have the summit 1 year before, and then I hope in 2020 countries will be able to be stronger in their commitments. And I believe India will be one of the countries that will be able to present stronger commitments in 2020 than the ones that were presented in Paris. And India has been leading very strongly this process.
But that doesn't change the situation, as the young gentleman said, on the superpowers' responsibility. Here you have a country that has walked out of the IPCC, that has walked out of the UNESCO, that has walked out of funding for refugees that are cared for by the United Nations. How do you, I think that's the question she has as well, how do you make those countries accountable, even in a world order, when you're talking about the international rules-based order?
Well, they are accountable vis-à-vis the international public opinion. They are accountable vis-à-vis the international community as a whole. But let's be clear, power relations are not balanced. And so there are countries that are more powerful than the others. And those countries that are more powerful tend to abuse of the powers they have. That is true in human relations, and it's true in countries. And this is a serious problem that we have, and that is why I am so much in favor of a multipolar world in which power relations will be more balanced, and no country will be able, with impunity, to take these kind of decisions alone. The present situation is not like that. The present situation is indeed a situation in which countries can take a number of unilateral decisions that impact negatively on other countries without having to pay a price for that. That's why the world is not perfect, and that's why your generation, I hope, will do much better than mine.
The lady in the, the lady in the black, yeah.
Mr. Guterres, thank you so much. I'm going to actually come back to the issue of the Rohingya that Suhasini just mentioned a minute ago. What role do you see India can play to sort of ease the humanitarian crisis in the region? It's in our neighborhood. The relations between Bangladesh and Myanmar, what role can India play? And also, just to sort of bring your attention to a point you made on the humanitarian commitments or human rights not being a priority for many countries in the world today, diplomacy and politics often are not eye to eye on the issue of human rights. So how do you see that play vis-a-vis India and the Rohingya question?
Well, there are two things that are necessary at the present moment. I'm not talking about the past. In the past, we have witnessed what was. I've been to North Rakhine State several times in the past in my capacity of High Commissioner for Refugees. And I have to tell you, I have never seen a community so discriminated in the world as the Rohingyas. They had no right of movement. They had to ask permission to the police to move, to go from one village to another. And you know how it is, the harassment by police in circumstances, especially where there is corruption, things of the sort. They could not marry without permission. Most of the children, of course, had a very limited access to school, and they could not go to university in Yangon. Access to health was limited too. Access to jobs and wealth was very limited. And I remember listening to a high-ranking officer of the administration in Myanmar, and this was years ago, telling me, look at them, they are darker, they are ugly, they are not ours, they should leave. So there is a very deeply rooted feeling of racism within the Myanmarese society, the Buddhist Myanmarese society, against the Rohingyas. And I also remember when I was there during the transition, there was, if you remember, a president in the transition after between the present regime and the military regime. And there were lots of people internally displaced. There were some confrontations at a certain moment, lots of people internally displaced. The Rohingyas internally displaced. There are still 140,000 Rohingyas internally displaced in Myanmar, still today. And the president was asking me to resettle them to another country, to make them refugees. And I told him, look, this is not my role. My role is to solve refugee problems, not to create new refugees. But this shows how deeply rooted is the negative perception of the generality of the people in relation to the Rohingyas. And this was, intensified with hate speech, with some monks that were preaching, and then the social media were of hate speech against this population, saying that they were bought by the British, they were not theirs, they should be leaving, which, by the way, is not entirely true. It's true that during the British Empire, people moved from place to place. You have many people from Indian origin in the Caribbean, no. But can you imagine now the Caribbean say, no, they all go back to India because, this is ridiculous, no? And the same obviously applies to those that moved into Myanmar. But let's be clear, there were always Muslims in Myanmar since the 16th or 15th century in the old Arakan Kingdom. So, but this negative feeling at a certain moment led to that terrible response to some terrorist attacks into some police stations that led to what was the ethnic cleansing of the northern part of North Rakhine State with 1,900,000, or but today with the others that were already there, more than 1 million people in Bangladesh, with horrible things. There were people burned, there were rapes, there were villages destroyed, people killed. It was really horrible. Even if there were some provocations and some attacks by some extremist groups, the reaction of the armed forces was absolutely brutal and unacceptable. Now, what can we do now, and what can India do now? First, support Bangladesh, because there is a huge humanitarian problem that needs a response. Fortunately, the monsoon I believe, is ending.
Cyclone season is coming.
Ending, and we were able to avoid the disaster that at a certain moment seemed looming because of the very fragile circumstances in which these communities are. There was a massive investment made by humanitarian organizations, but even that was not enough. So, I mean, support Bangladesh in helping these people. And second, put pressure on Myanmar, and especially on the military in Myanmar, for what needs to be a massive investment, physical reconstruction investment, but investment in reconciliation to create the conditions for these people to be able to go back. These people will not go back in the present circumstances easily because they are afraid. And because the what is in place is still not something in which they can live with a dignified life. So that massive investment needs to be done, and I believe that countries like India that have good relations with Myanmar are in a good place to put all possible pressure, like China, like others, on Myanmar to do this kind of investment and to create the conditions for people to go back. No, it's not enough to sign a paper. And the UN has signed with Myanmar, the UNHCR and the UNDP, a memorandum of understanding to allow for the facilitation of returns. But it's not enough to say things or to sign things. We need to have this massive investment, especially in reconciliation. I must tell you, I knew that there were forms of extremism in all religions, but I always thought that there was no Buddhist fundamentalism, because Buddhism seemed such a harmonious religion. I mean, but indeed there is also Buddhist fundamentalism, and there was, I mean, the level of hate speech that spread in Myanmar, and especially in Rakhine State, was absolutely terrible. So there is a long way to go. We need to be patient. We need to support those that are still, but we need to do something to make this return possible. Because one thing I'd like to say, everybody is very worried about terrorism, and everybody is very worried about violent extremism. To keep a population in such a discriminated situation, in such a terrible situation, is an invitation for terrorist groups to try to take profit of that. And this could have negative impacts not only in Bangladesh or in Myanmar, but in the whole region. So to support the Rohingya community, for them to be able to go back and to enjoy the normal rights of citizenship is, I think, of enormous importance for all of us.
Right. Well, you've described, as I said, there were many who wanted to hear you speak about that. You've described a limited toolkit already that the United Nations has, limited leverage, limited ability to make nations do the right thing. Do you think sanctions by the UN is an answer?
I do believe that there should be accountability in relation to the crimes that were committed. And it is clear that there were crimes that were committed, crimes that were very serious. And I do believe that there should be accountability to those crimes. And I do believe that, I know that Bangladesh has seized the International Criminal Court. I don't know how this will evolve. But, I mean, what has happened is indeed, I mean, unbelievably bad.
All right. Let's go to the gentleman who has a mic over there.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Araman, and I have a question related to something very basic, and that is food. Food. Yes. So a few minutes ago, you mentioned the word paradox. And one such paradox is worldwide, obesity levels are rising at an alarming rate. But still, we see people are dying out of hunger in countries like Africa, even India. So why do you think such a problem exists? And more importantly, what are your solutions for this problem? Thank you.
I don't think that this is the same problem. I think there are two different problems. One problem is to make sure that we guarantee the levels of nutrition that are necessary everywhere in the world. And for that, I mean, there are many things to be done, both from the point of view of the Sustainable Development Goals, the rural development, I mean, there are many questions that need to be addressed, family agriculture, I mean, a number of things that can be done, and it's very important to do it. There are also humanitarian responses to famine situations, and last year we could avert 4 dramatic situations thanks to massive humanitarian help, but that we need to avoid instead of just responding. But obesity is a different problem. And obesity is taking place not because the rich are becoming obese and the poor. Obesity is a problem even of poor communities because of bad nutrition, because of eating and drinking the wrong things. I mean, I'm not going to say something that could be, but most of the things that we eat and drink and that are in the publicity of big companies are indeed because they have too much sugar, they have too much things of this. I mean, we eat a lot of junk food, and that is the reason why even me, I'm not sure if it's obesity or a little bit, but I'm too fat. So because I eat too many things I shouldn't be eating. And so the two things are not linked. It's not because there is obesity that there is hunger. Many people that are very poor have obesity problems because exactly the nutrition they have is totally inadequate in relation to their needs. So we need to have the two campaigns, and the two campaigns need to be very strongly assumed. And obesity is a matter where I think public powers need to do something. For instance, not allowing some kind of products, or putting taxes in some kind of products, or making sure that, because sometimes it's big multinational corporations that are selling us with fantastic advertisements, things that are contributing to our illnesses.
Right, and at the same time, as he said, hunger and malnutrition is, I think, the biggest health risk. Could we get a mic over here?
So my question is regarding the public health. So
Public health.
Yeah.
Public health?
Sorry?
Public health. Yeah.
Public health. So regarding gender issues, how United Nations look towards the cases of rape and sexual harassment as a public health issue?
Well, rape is not only a public health issue.
I know, but
rape is a crime
Yeah.
that needs to be fought with a lot of intensity, and this is something in which I mean, we are totally committed to fight, and we are doing it inside the house very strongly, all forms of sexual harassment, and in particular rape. But obviously, rape is also a problem of public health. But rape is in the first line of our action worldwide in order to make sure that countries mobilize themselves for rape to be severely punished, and for those that are the victims of rape to have all the kinds of psychosocial support and integration in society to fight the kind of discrimination and stigmatization that still exists in many societies, to work with communities. So there is a long list of things that need to be done, not only to fight rape, but to support the victims of rape that sometimes suffer twice, because they are raped and then because they are discriminated and marginalized and stigmatized by the families and the society.
And I'm sorry, I'm just saying this, that during the conflict zones, during the climate change, you know, the most affected are women and children who are being raped, and these sexual harassment, sexual violence stories don't come up, and so the UN don't take any account for all these sexual harassment stories and all, you know, like.
I can tell you that two things. In relation to sexual harassment by UN staff, or with UN staff, we have now created a special unit of investigation with 5 women and 1 man, specialists in sexual harassment and in victims' approach of investigation. We have a hotline working permanently. We have intensive training, but especially this investigation is supposed to conclude in 3 months. So it's something completely new in the system, to make sure that people really understand that sexual harassment, that we have tolerance zero in relation to sexual harassment. In relation to sexual exploitation abuse done to others by peacekeepers or others, we have now mobilized countries. We have codes of conduct and compacts signed with countries. We have one with India. We have leaders that have assumed to be champions on that. The Indian Prime Minister is among them, to make sure that countries do because we cannot punish a soldier of a country. It is only the legislation of that country to make sure that countries will assume fully their responsibilities in relation to this. This is an area for us, absolute priority, and we are really working hard to change things.
I think even within the United Nations, a very senior official was just dismissed on those.
Yes, and we are
on those charges.
And this is. It's going to happen more frequently, because these were situations that were hidden. You know, there is a kind of a tolerance for these kind of things and intimidation, and so we need a cultural change also to make sure that these things are eradicated once and for all.
Let's move on to
Secretary General, this side. Here, on your right.
Right there.
Yeah. Secretary General, you were this morning at the Rajghat. You were paying homage to the father of the nation, father of our nation, and we are marking a day of non-violence. But unfortunately, this day, India continues to suffer the menace of terrorism as well, and has been a victim of terror for a very long time. A country which has been propounding the proponents of ahimsa, non-violence, for a very long time. Do you think it's time that the United Nations should define terrorism? Do you think it's time that Comprehensive Convention of International Terrorism, the treaty, should be adopted and not be in a deadlock for decades together? And because there are countries in our neighborhood that have been playing havoc in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. Thank you.
Well, we have just created an Office of Counterterrorism in the Secretariat. We have launched a program not only on counterterrorism but on the prevention of violent extremism. We have now a center of coordination of the 38 agencies that deal with that to be much more effective in the cooperation with member states. And we are putting more and more terrorism in the agenda of the Security Council. So it's clear that we are totally committed to it, but it's also clear that today terrorism became a major problem because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we have more and more conflicts interlinked and more conflicts linked to terrorism. And then you have a number of situations in which, and I was talking about the Rohingya, fortunately there are not many Rohingyas recruited for the moment. I think it was possible to avoid it until now. But there are situations in which discrimination and unresolved problems facilitate the work of terrorists recruiting people. And we need also to address those root causes.
I think is that since 1996, countries have not been able to agree to the definition of terrorism.
Now, there is no agreement on the definition of terrorism. It's not so dramatic because there are a number of tools and instruments that are working on that. So it's not because of that that we are not doing things. But the problem of the definition of terrorism has several complexities. For instance, the terrorism committed by a state. So there are a number of things that are complicated to have a common definition of terrorism. It is true, we never managed to have it, and we never managed to have a true convention because of the definition. And India has been in the front line of supporting these, and we fully support India in this regard.
All right, let's take a few more questions. I think there's a gentleman there, just behind you, yeah. No, behind you. Yeah.
Sir, I'm referring to the report by one of your colleagues, Zaid Hussain.
When have I?
Colleagues, UN
colleagues,
Human Rights Council, the Commission.
Zaid Hussain, and his report on human rights. Now that report was very strongly refuted by India. What is your assessment of that report? And did you discuss that issue with Prime Minister Modi? And when you meet Sushma Swaraj, perhaps tomorrow, is the issue going to come up?
Now, one thing you need to understand, the human rights area as the refugee area of the UN are areas that enjoy full autonomy. I don't discuss the reports of the Human Rights High Commissioners, I don't discuss the reports of the Refugee Commissioner. They have independence, they play their role, and of course, countries can agree or disagree with their role, but their reports are not reports that are endorsed or not endorsed by the Secretary-General. It's their reports. They have and they give an important contribution to the discussion of human rights. That doesn't necessarily mean that countries need to fully accept those reports. But those reports are done in a strictly independent way, and I have as a principle never to make any comment on the reports of both the High Commissioner for Refugees and the Human Rights High Commissioner. When I was High Commissioner for Refugees, I also wouldn't like to have the Secretary-General commenting on my reports because they came from my own mandate, and we need to respect the independence of mandates.
All right, I'm going to try and take some questions from places I haven't before, so I'll come up as well, but if you could...
And this is something the government of India knows very well.
To the lady behind you, yeah.
Sir, you spoke about ethnic cleansing, right? Now, in today's world, we have a lot of issues, especially the recent issue of Uyghurs and ethnic cleansing of Uyghurs in China, as to how these people are being sent into rehabilitation camps, right? So what do we as the international community and these member states do when these countries themselves do not want to be held accountable, right? You mentioned the point of having public opinion and international opinion forming against these countries, but still that is not very effective. So what is a tangible solution for these refugees, considering that other countries also do not want to take refugees and are having very closed policies? So
here in India, there isn't a great... she's asking about how do you make countries more accountable? The same question really, but also the question of countries not wanting to take more refugees.
There are two different things. First, the accountability in relation to crimes. We have the International Criminal Court. If the country is part to the International Criminal Court, the prosecution has the right to immediately intervene if the country is not in conditions to itself solve the problem, which is obviously the case that you are mentioning. But if the country is not a member to the ICC, it's the Security Council that has the possibility to raise the issue to the court. And the Security Council, there are, as you know, vetoes. And as there are vetoes, we are seeing that the number of situations in the recent past in which the Security Council was able to seize the International Criminal Court is practically zero. So we have here a problem of accountability, or lack of accountability in the world. It is true. We have a problem of lack of accountability in the world. The second thing that you raise is about refugee protection. I've been saying time and time again that it's totally unacceptable that countries like Bangladesh, that are relatively poor, receive 1 million refugees, that countries like Pakistan has received 4 or 5 million Afghans, that countries like Ethiopia has received more than 500,000 refugees, and that rich countries in the world are closing their doors. And what I've been saying time and time again is that it's absolutely essential to reestablish the integrity of the refugee protection regime. That is something, a concern that I fully share, and I have 10 years in my history fighting to avoid it, and I have to say that things got worse, not because I left UNHCR, but indeed, during those 10 years, most of the refugee protection regimes were in place. There were very few cases of refoulement, there were very few cases of borders being closed. Refoulement is when people are sent back against their will to the country where they face persecution. Very few countries of borders being closed. There were incidents here or there, but basically the refugee protection regime was respected. And unfortunately, more recently, we are seeing more and more countries either disrespecting the regime or reducing, for instance, the number of resettlement cases. Resettlement is a very important tool to provide people with better conditions of life, moving them for a developed country where they can have a better future. And we see the number of resettlement opportunities being reduced by some countries.
Do you think the world is getting a smaller heart? Is that the problem?
Not everywhere. Look at the Rohingyas in Bangladesh. I mean, look at what has happened to several African countries. I mean, Uganda has received more than 1 million refugees from South Sudan. I mean, Uganda is a very small country and not a rich one. So there are fantastic examples of, for now there are more than 1 million Venezuelans that are being received by Colombia, by Ecuador, there are fantastic examples of generosity. Usually generosity is, how do you say it in English? They say inversely proportional, inversely proportional to richness. The more rich a country is, the less generous it is.
All right, we're going to take a question from up there.
Can we still call ourselves a multipolar world where the international organization like the United Nations holds a monopoly in the anarchic society?
I can't see you, but I believe you are there.
Up. The balcony up.
Yes, the lights are terrible.
Oh, okay.
Ask your question.
Can we still call ourselves a multipolar world where the international organization like the United Nations holds a monopoly in the anarchic society? Like there's no alternate source of power, keeping a check on the member states of the UN misusing the power?
All right, there's no check on the member states of the UN. We've also got a question on the same issue that says given the veto that UN Security Council members have, is the UN a toothless organization?
I mean, toothless means that there are no teeth at all. I would say that the mouth is rather strange, because there are areas where there are teeth and there are areas without them. So it depends a lot on where the food goes. So food goes to one area, sometimes there is teeth. If the good food goes to another area, there is no way to digest it. It's true. It's very unfair.
All right. One more from here.
Ma'am, here.
Who? Where? Okay, go ahead, speak.
Okay, so given the nature of international relations and global arena, also referring to the very idea of providing alternative centers of power or the
Okay, just ask the question. We don't have that much time.
Okay, so why is hard power referred over soft power? Like the United Nations Security Council referred over anything else in the international arena?
All right. Why is hard power more effective than soft power?
Why hard?
Hard power, as in why is the Security Council more important than the rest of the world?
No, I am a great supporter of soft power, and that's the only power I have. Sometimes I would say very soft power. But it's true that if we want to, in a certain moment, impose a solution to those that are horrible violators of human rights, or those that are aggressors in relation to neighbors or whatever, you would need that power. And that is where it is dramatic if the Security Council is not able to exercise it.
All right. I have 5 minutes, so only questions, no long speech. Go ahead.
So recently you gave an interview to the Atlantic magazine where you mentioned about how the world sees a re-emergence of irrationality across the globe, and we need to have...
Question.
So the question being, how do you suggest that the world moves forward towards increasing the number of liberal democracies where you yourself proclaim that the world is moving towards irrationality?
I mean, it is true we are seeing authoritarianism on the rise. It is true we are seeing the human rights agenda losing grounds, namely to the national sovereignty agenda. I think it's absolutely essential that first we do everything we can according to our own capacities, but we speak up whenever necessary in defense of democratic values and in defense of the need to fully respect and protect human rights. And we see sometimes trends. No? In the 90s, when I was in government, it was a moment of flourishing of democracy and increased respect for human rights. Now we are in the reverse trend. We need to fight back.
All right, go, the lady there.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Shreya.
Question, don't read
Okay. What are your views on the global gender gap, which is ever growing, considering it will take more than 100 years to close this gap, according to the World Economic Forum report of 2017?
The gender gap is increasing, and
the global gender
gap will take 100 years.
The gender gap is increasing. Is not increasing in many areas. It's increasing in a few. It's decreasing in others. It's true. It would take 100 years. So how do you solve this problem? In my humble opinion, this is essentially a question of power. We live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture, and we need to reverse these power relations. Because if you don't reverse the power relations, things will not happen by themselves. So what am I doing for this? What I launched in the UN is a program for gender parity. Now I have 25 women and 21 men in my senior management committee. And there was a majority of men. The leaders of the UN at country level, called the resident coordinators, now we have 50.4% of women and 49.6% of men, which is, there is more women than men. And so these are the areas where I can appoint myself. And there we just forced things. But every department of the UN has now presented a program to reach parity up to 2028. And I believe parity will be a key instrument to equilibrate power relations. On the other hand, we have campaigns on sexual harassment, on sexual exploitation and abuse, on other things. We have campaigns on education for girls. I mean, there's a number of other things that we need to do. But in my opinion, the central question remains the question of power.
All right, I have time for one last question. Go ahead.
Sir, how do you see communalism in India, and how does it affect India's development in global context?
Communalism. You were speaking about extremist violence, fundamentalism. How do you see it affecting India's growth? And what do you think about the problem of communalism? Basically, communalism, it's any kind of, religious fundamentalism.
Well, I don't think India is in the worst situation in the world. So I've always seen India as a country with extreme diversity. I've always seen India as a country that is very welcoming for people coming from the outside, namely refugees, migrants. I've only seen India a country where there is a lot of respect for different people. But of course, in India, there are forms of extremism, as in any other part of the world. I don't think this is the major problem that you face. I would say, if I would look at this Indian society, I would say that if I would have to be concerned with two things, would still be poverty and inequality. And that is where I believe, the big effort is being made to address it. But I don't think it is, I always seen with a lot of admiration the extraordinary diversity of the Indian society.
And that's important too.
My wife was born in Goa. And when I go to Goa, it's quite amazing to see. In the same village, there is an Hindu temple, there is a Catholic church, and there is perfect interreligious harmony. So I think that is the prevailing tradition in India. And that is something you should preserve and you should cherish.
All right, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much. Last year, the Secretary General spoke about a world in pieces and said the need of the hour was for a world in peace, for everyone to work towards a world in peace. This year, he's talked about the trust deficit in the world. Very quickly, what do you think is the biggest trend for the next year?
I have no idea.
Well, at least that's honest. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause. Thank you so much. And thank you for staying. All right, thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for coming and for your questions. You've been a great audience.